Have you ever walked into a room and instantly felt something wasn't right, even before anyone spoke? Have you ever sensed the emotions of others so deeply that they felt like your own? And have you ever been told you're different, even though no one could explain exactly why? What if those moments weren't coincidences? What if they were clues? Today, we're going to explore 7 powerful signs that may reveal a rare way of experiencing the world. One that challenges convention, questions appearances, and sees beneath the surface. But before we begin, let me make one thing clear. This isn't about labels. It's not about convincing yourself you're special. And it's certainly not about believing you have supernatural powers. It's about self-awareness. Because the moment you begin to understand how your mind works, how you process emotion, and why you've always felt slightly out of step with the crowd, your entire perspective can change. Some people naturally follow patterns. Others instinctively break them. Some accept the first answer they hear. Others can't stop searching until they uncover the truth beneath it. If you've spent your life questioning assumptions, noticing what others overlook, or feeling like you were born to see the world from a completely different angle, then stay with me until the end. You may recognize yourself in ways you never expected. As we go through these 7 signs, don't rush to identify with every one of them. Instead, listen carefully. Reflect honestly. The goal isn't to fit into a category. The goal is to understand yourself more deeply than you did yesterday. Because real strength doesn't come from being different. It comes from knowing who you are, trusting your perception, and using your awareness to create wisdom instead of confusion, compassion instead of judgment, and clarity instead of fear. So take a deep breath, clear your mind, and set aside every assumption you've carried into this moment. By the end of this journey, you may not just see these signs differently. You may see yourself differently. Let's begin with the first sign. One of the biggest misunderstandings people have is believing that someone who is deeply compassionate will leave the moment they're hurt. In reality, the opposite is often true. People who naturally care about others tend to stay far longer than they should. They don't walk away after one disagreement, one disappointing moment, or one mistake. Instead, they look for reasons to understand. They search for explanations instead of excuses. They convince themselves that maybe the other person is going through a difficult season, carrying unseen burdens, or simply doesn't realize the impact of their actions. Their first instinct isn't to judge, it's to understand. And because of that, they often give far more chances than anyone around them realizes. From the outside, it may seem as though everything is fine. Conversations continue, smiles are exchanged, daily routines remain unchanged. But beneath the surface, something subtle is happening. Every ignored feeling, every broken promise, every dismissive comment leaves a small mark. One mark by itself isn't enough to destroy trust. Yet over time, those marks begin to accumulate. What many people fail to understand is that emotional exhaustion rarely arrives all at once. It grows quietly. It develops in silence. It builds from hundreds of moments that seem insignificant on their own, but become impossible to ignore when viewed together. Imagine carrying a backpack. At first, someone places a single stone inside. You barely notice the weight. Then another stone appears, still manageable. Then another, and another. None of them feel heavy enough to make you stop walking. But eventually you realize you're exhausted, not because of one massive burden, but because of everything you've been carrying without realizing how much it had accumulated. Emotional relationships often work the same way. It isn't one painful conversation that changes everything. It's the constant pattern of feeling unseen, unheard, or unimportant. This is why repeated emotional neglect can be so damaging. Neglect isn't always loud. Sometimes it doesn't look like cruelty at all. It can appear in the form of conversations where one person's feelings are consistently dismissed. It can show up when someone's excitement is ignored, their concerns are minimized, or their efforts are taken for granted. It appears when appreciation slowly disappears and respect becomes an expectation instead of something actively demonstrated. Over time, these experiences send an unspoken message: your emotional world doesn't matter here. That message is far more powerful than many people realize. The interesting thing is that someone with a strong sense of empathy often won't confront every disappointment, not because they don't notice it, but because they don't want every interaction to become a conflict. They tell themselves that keeping the peace is more valuable than winning an argument. They choose patience. They choose understanding. They choose grace. But every time they silence their own needs to protect someone else's comfort, they pay a small emotional price. At first, the cost feels insignificant. Eventually, it becomes impossible to ignore. There comes a point where they begin observing more than speaking. They stop expecting dramatic change and start paying attention to patterns instead. Patterns reveal character more clearly than isolated events. Anyone can apologize after making a mistake. Anyone can promise to do better. Lasting trust, however, is built through consistent actions repeated over time. When words and behavior no longer match, people naturally begin believing the behavior instead of the promises. Something else changes as well. Their energy shifts. They become quieter. They stop explaining every feeling because previous attempts led nowhere. They stop asking for understanding because they no longer expect it. They stop trying to convince someone to value what should never have required convincing in the first place. To an outside observer, it may appear as though they've become distant for no reason. In reality, the distance began long before anyone noticed it. It started the moment they realized their emotional investment was no longer being matched. One of the greatest mistakes people make is assuming silence means everything has improved. Silence can also mean someone has stopped believing their voice will make a difference. That's an important distinction. Healthy silence brings peace. Hurt silence often signals resignation. Instead of arguing, they begin accepting that the relationship may never become what they hoped it could be. Acceptance changes everything because once expectations disappear, emotional attachment often begins fading with them. As this process continues, they become less focused on changing the other person and more focused on protecting their own emotional well-being. That shift isn't driven by anger. It's driven by clarity. They recognize that constantly carrying the emotional weight for two people isn't sustainable. Relationships thrive when care, respect, and effort move in both directions. When one person consistently gives while the other consistently receives, imbalance becomes inevitable. Eventually, even the most patient heart recognizes that compassion should never require abandoning self-respect. There is another reason this transition often surprises people. Many assume that if someone is truly unhappy, they will constantly complain or threaten to leave. Yet some individuals process disappointment internally. They observe, they reflect, they wait, they hope. Every new opportunity feels like another chance for things to improve. But hope without change slowly transforms into acceptance, and acceptance quietly becomes detachment. By the time they finally decide to step away, the decision often feels sudden only to the people who weren't paying attention. For the person leaving, that decision may have been forming over weeks, months, or even years. It wasn't created by one conversation. It was created by a long history of unmet emotional needs, overlooked efforts, and repeated moments that communicated, intentionally or not, that their inner world mattered less than maintaining the status quo. Walking away at that point isn't about proving a lesson or making someone regret their choices. It's about recognizing that peace cannot exist where respect is consistently absent. Choosing distance becomes less about rejecting another person and more about reclaiming emotional balance. It is the quiet realization that protecting your energy is not selfish, and that every healthy relationship should leave both people feeling valued, heard, and emotionally safe rather than chronically depleted. Sometimes the strongest decision isn't the loudest one. Sometimes strength is found in recognizing when understanding has become one-sided, when patience has turned into self-neglect, and when continuing to stay would require sacrificing parts of yourself that should never have been negotiable. That realization rarely arrives overnight. It is earned through experience, reflection, and the difficult understanding that while compassion is one of the greatest strengths a person can possess, it should never come at the cost of their own peace. Trust is one of the few things in life that doesn't demand perfection. It doesn't require flawless behavior, constant agreement, or never making mistakes. What it does require is consistency. It asks for honesty, accountability, and the confidence that the person standing in front of you is the same person when you're not looking. Once that consistency begins to disappear, something changes beneath the surface of every relationship. It isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, it's almost invisible at first. But the moment trust begins to crack, every future interaction is filtered through uncertainty. And uncertainty has a way of reshaping even the strongest connection. People who are naturally sensitive to the emotions and intentions of others often notice changes long before anyone says a word. They may not always know exactly what's wrong, but they sense when the atmosphere shifts. They notice the hesitation before an answer. They recognize when enthusiasm feels forced, when affection becomes mechanical, or when explanations stop matching actions. These observations aren't based on magic or mind reading. They come from paying close attention to patterns. Human behavior follows patterns far more often than people realize, and when those patterns suddenly change, it becomes difficult to ignore. This is why manipulation can be so destructive. Manipulation doesn't always involve obvious lies or dramatic deception. Sometimes it hides behind subtle habits that slowly alter another person's perception of reality. A promise is made but quietly forgotten. A concern is dismissed as an overreaction. Responsibility is shifted from one person to another until the individual who was hurt begins questioning whether they were hurt at all. Over time, these moments accumulate, creating confusion where there was once certainty. The relationship begins to feel less like a partnership and more like a puzzle that never quite fits together. One of the most common forms of manipulation is inconsistency. Imagine someone who treats you with extraordinary kindness one day and cold indifference the next, without explanation. Naturally, your mind begins searching for reasons. Did you do something wrong? Did you misunderstand them? Should you try harder? Instead of evaluating the other person's behavior, you begin evaluating yourself. That shift is significant because it redirects attention away from the actual problem. Rather than questioning whether the relationship is healthy, you start questioning whether you're enough. For someone who values emotional connection, this can become exhausting. They don't immediately assume bad intentions. In fact, they often do the opposite. They search for excuses that protect the other person's image. They remind themselves that everyone has difficult days. They tell themselves that stress changes people. They convince themselves that patience will eventually solve what honesty has not. While compassion is a beautiful quality, it can also become a trap when it repeatedly replaces clear judgment. There comes a point, however, when observation begins replacing optimism. Instead of focusing on isolated incidents, they start recognizing cycles. The same promises are repeated. The same disappointments return. The same apologies appear, followed by the same behavior. Suddenly, the issue is no longer about a single mistake. It's about predictability. When negative patterns become predictable, trust quietly begins disappearing because trust depends on believing tomorrow can be better than yesterday. Another powerful form of manipulation is making someone doubt their own emotional experience. Imagine expressing genuine hurt only to be told you're too sensitive, imagining things, or making problems out of nothing. After hearing this enough times, even confident individuals begin questioning their own judgment. They hesitate before expressing emotions because they're no longer sure whether those emotions are valid. This creates an invisible form of emotional isolation. Instead of feeling understood, they begin feeling alone even while standing beside someone they care about. The damage caused by repeated dishonesty reaches even deeper. A single lie may create disappointment. Repeated dishonesty creates uncertainty about everything else. Once someone realizes that truth has become optional, every conversation changes. Every explanation becomes suspect. Every reassurance is quietly examined for hidden meaning. The relationship slowly transforms into an environment where certainty is replaced by constant analysis. That kind of emotional vigilance is exhausting because it forces the mind to remain alert instead of relaxed. Healthy relationships provide psychological safety. They create an environment where people don't have to investigate every word or interpret every silence. They know where they stand because honesty makes uncertainty unnecessary. When deception enters the relationship repeatedly, that safety disappears. The mind begins protecting itself by expecting disappointment before it arrives. Instead of looking forward to conversations, a person starts preparing for confusion. Instead of expecting truth, they begin anticipating another contradiction. Ironically, manipulation often succeeds in the short term because it creates temporary control. But over the long term, it produces exactly the opposite effect. Every attempt to distort reality, avoid accountability, or conceal the truth weakens the foundation that keeps relationships alive. Respect cannot grow where honesty is absent. Intimacy cannot deepen where transparency is replaced by performance. Eventually, the emotional distance becomes impossible to ignore. What makes this process especially difficult to recognize is that it rarely unfolds in dramatic moments. Relationships usually don't collapse because of one unforgettable argument. They decline through repetition. Tiny inconsistencies repeated over months become more influential than grand gestures offered once in a while. Human beings remember patterns far more deeply than isolated experiences. Kind words lose their impact when they consistently conflict with observable behavior. As this realization develops, something changes inside the person who has spent so long trying to understand. They stop searching for explanations because explanations no longer change outcomes. They stop hoping each apology represents a permanent turning point because history has taught them otherwise. Their focus gradually shifts away from what is being said and toward what is consistently being done. That shift is often the beginning of emotional freedom because actions reveal priorities more clearly than promises ever can. They also begin rediscovering something they may have ignored for a long time: their own intuition. Not intuition as a mystical force, but as the accumulated wisdom of repeated experience. The mind has an extraordinary ability to recognize familiar patterns even before conscious awareness catches up. That quiet feeling that something isn't right often emerges because countless small observations have already formed a larger picture. Instead of dismissing those signals, they begin respecting them. With every honest reflection, the confusion starts fading. What once seemed like isolated misunderstandings now appears as a consistent pattern. The emotional fog begins lifting. They recognize that trust cannot survive where truth is negotiable, and that no amount of patience can compensate for a lack of integrity. They understand that believing someone should never require ignoring what they repeatedly demonstrate through their actions. Eventually, a quiet decision forms, not one fueled by anger or revenge, but by clarity. They recognize that relationships are meant to provide stability rather than constant uncertainty. They realize that genuine care does not require endless guessing, emotional self-doubt, or continual efforts to earn basic honesty. Trust, once broken repeatedly, does not disappear because someone stopped caring. It disappears because every contradiction, every broken promise, and every attempt to manipulate reality slowly replaced confidence with caution. And once caution becomes the dominant emotion in a relationship, genuine connection becomes increasingly difficult to sustain, no matter how much affection once existed between two people. One of the greatest misconceptions people have is believing that silence always means weakness. They assume that if someone stops arguing, stops explaining, or stops asking to be understood, it must mean they no longer care. But silence can mean something entirely different. Sometimes, silence is the final stage of understanding. It is the moment when a person realizes that repeating the same conversation will not produce a different outcome. Instead of spending energy trying to convince someone to listen, they begin listening to themselves. That shift is quiet, almost invisible, yet it changes everything. There comes a point in certain relationships where every difficult conversation begins to sound familiar. The words change, but the pattern remains the same. Concerns are raised, promises are made, hope briefly returns, and then everything slowly settles back into what it was before. At first, people naturally believe that effort will create change. They think that if they explain themselves more clearly, become more patient, or choose better words, understanding will eventually happen. That belief keeps them invested long after others might have walked away. They continue trying because they believe relationships deserve commitment. They believe people can grow. They believe that honest communication has the power to repair almost anything. Over time, however, reality begins speaking louder than intention. It becomes clear that communication alone cannot transform a relationship unless both people are equally willing to hear uncomfortable truths. One person cannot carry emotional responsibility for two. One person cannot repair what another refuses to acknowledge. Slowly, the realization begins to settle that constant effort without mutual participation isn't strength, it is imbalance. This realization rarely arrives in a dramatic moment. It usually develops through countless ordinary experiences. A concern is dismissed. An apology is repeated without meaningful change. A vulnerable conversation is forgotten as though it never happened. Individually, these moments appear small. Together, they create a powerful message. That message isn't spoken directly, but it is felt deeply. It says that emotional investment is no longer being returned with the same level of care. What happens next is often misunderstood by everyone watching from the outside. The person who once fought for the relationship becomes unexpectedly calm. They stop defending every feeling. They stop chasing every misunderstanding. They stop asking questions that have already been answered through repeated behavior. To someone who isn't paying attention, this calmness might look like acceptance. In reality, it is often the beginning of emotional detachment. Detachment is not the absence of feeling. It is the gradual withdrawal of emotional energy from a place where that energy no longer produces growth. It happens when hope is slowly replaced by clarity. Instead of asking, "How can I fix this?" the question becomes, "Why am I carrying this alone?" That single question changes perspective. It redirects attention away from changing another person and toward understanding personal boundaries. Healthy boundaries are often misunderstood. Some people believe boundaries are walls designed to keep others out. In reality, boundaries are guidelines that protect mutual respect. They define what allows a relationship to remain healthy rather than harmful. Without boundaries, kindness easily becomes self-sacrifice. Patience becomes permission for unhealthy behavior to continue. Compassion begins replacing accountability until one person consistently gives while the other consistently receives. There is a difference between supporting someone through difficult times and repeatedly abandoning your own emotional needs to maintain peace. The first strengthens relationships. The second slowly weakens the individual who continues making every compromise. Eventually, even the most patient person recognizes that protecting inner peace is not selfish. It is necessary. You cannot continually pour energy into a relationship that leaves you emotionally empty and expect to remain the same person. An interesting transformation begins once this awareness develops. Instead of reacting emotionally to every disappointment, observation takes its place. The need to argue disappears because the answers have already become obvious. There is nothing left to prove. There is nothing left to debate. Actions have spoken with greater consistency than words ever could. That realization creates a remarkable sense of emotional clarity. People often expect dramatic endings because movies have taught us that every meaningful relationship ends with emotional confrontations, raised voices, or unforgettable speeches. Real life is often very different. Sometimes the most significant ending happens in complete silence. No announcement is made. No final argument takes place. There is simply a quiet decision that enough has become enough. What appears sudden to others has usually been developing internally for a very long time. Long before the distance became visible, countless moments of reflection had already taken place. Every disappointment had been revisited. Every possibility had been considered. Every reason for staying had been weighed against the emotional cost of remaining. By the time the decision becomes visible, most of the emotional work has already been completed. This is why attempts to reconnect after that point can sometimes feel surprisingly ineffective. The assumption is often that one meaningful conversation can restore everything. But relationships are built through consistent experiences, not isolated moments. Just as trust gradually weakens through repetition, emotional closure gradually strengthens through repeated reflection. Once someone has truly accepted that a relationship no longer supports their well-being, returning to old patterns becomes increasingly difficult. Choosing distance is rarely about punishing another person. It is about ending an internal conflict. It is the decision to stop fighting reality. Instead of hoping someone will become who they continually choose not to be, acceptance takes the place of expectation. That acceptance frees an extraordinary amount of emotional energy. Energy once spent analyzing conversations, anticipating disappointment, or questioning intentions can finally be directed toward healing, personal growth, and relationships built on mutual respect. There is also a profound lesson hidden within this process. Peace is not created by avoiding conflict at any cost. Genuine peace comes from living in alignment with your values. If honesty matters, surround yourself with honesty. If respect matters, refuse to normalize disrespect. If emotional safety matters, recognize when an environment consistently undermines it. Every healthy decision begins with recognizing that your well-being deserves the same care you have always offered to others. Eventually, the silence that once felt painful begins to feel different. It no longer represents loss. It represents freedom. It becomes evidence that emotional energy is no longer being invested where it cannot grow. The absence of constant tension creates room for clarity, confidence, and renewed self-respect. Instead of waking each day wondering how to repair another person's choices, attention returns to building a life rooted in authenticity and balance. Perhaps the most powerful realization of all is that walking away does not erase compassion. It simply changes its direction. Instead of giving endless understanding to someone unwilling to meet you halfway, you begin extending that same understanding toward yourself. You recognize your own needs without guilt. You acknowledge your own limits without shame. You understand that caring deeply for others should never require neglecting your own emotional health. When that realization fully settles in, silence is no longer an escape. It becomes a conscious choice. Not because there is nothing left to say, but because everything that truly mattered has already been demonstrated through experience. In that quiet space, there is no desire for revenge, no need for dramatic endings, and no obsession with being understood. There is only the calm confidence that comes from knowing your peace is worth protecting, your boundaries deserve to be honored, and your future belongs in relationships where care, honesty, and respect flow naturally in both directions. So, if any part of today's message felt familiar, don't rush to place a label on yourself. Instead, ask a more important question: what is my life trying to teach me? Every relationship you experience leaves behind a lesson. Some teach you how to trust, others teach you how to forgive, and a few teach you the value of protecting your peace before it disappears completely. The truth is, walking away isn't always a sign that someone stopped caring. Sometimes it's proof that they cared for far too long. Sometimes the quietest goodbye carries the deepest story because it comes after countless chances, endless patience, and more understanding than anyone ever realized. Remember this: the people who value honesty will never force you to question your worth. The people who truly respect you won't make you earn basic kindness. And the relationships that are meant to last will never require you to sacrifice your identity just to keep them alive. If you found yourself reflecting during this video, take that as an invitation. Not to judge others, but to understand yourself more deeply. Self-awareness is one of the greatest strengths anyone can develop because the moment you understand your own patterns, you stop becoming trapped by them. Now here's something to think about. The strongest people aren't always the loudest. The wisest decisions aren't always the most dramatic. And sometimes, the greatest act of courage is choosing peace over permission, growth over familiarity, and self-respect over endless compromise. So the next time someone quietly walks out of your life, don't ask only, why did they leave? Ask yourself, what happened long before they made that decision? The answer to that question may change the way you see every relationship you've ever had. If this message gave you a new perspective, make sure to subscribe and join us for more insights into human behavior, emotional intelligence, and personal growth. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, and let us know in the comments, have you ever reached a point where silence said more than words ever could? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read. Until next time, protect your peace, value your integrity, keep growing every single day, and never underestimate the quiet strength of a person who has finally learned their own worth.